breaking down everyday workplace issues and diagnosing the hidden sickness, not just the obvious symptom. Our hosts, James and Kobe.
Did we lose a patient?
No, that's just my lunch.
Hey, thanks for joining us. I'm Kobe, he's James, and let's get started with a question. Why does fixing a bad leader feel impossible?
Yeah. Largely because the person who's usually responsible for fixing a bad leader is often the bad leader themselves. Let's look at any business that's not governed by a board of directors. The CEO or the owner, president, whatever title they choose to give themselves, is the ultimate authority. And if they are, as is unfortunately quite often the case, the cause of bad leadership or the bad leader themselves, then it really becomes a vicious cycle of the only person who is really able or has the authority to solve the problem is the problem themselves. It not like all hope is lost, but it does illustrate why it feels so impossible to fix bad leadership at the highest levels when we look at it from an internal problem or an internal perspective. Because if somebody lacks the self-awareness to critically reflect on their own behaviors and their actions, or lacks the emotional intelligence to be able to hear and receive feedback that they don't like, then they're going to lash out. All right. They're going to, when somebody shines a light on their bad leadership habits, they're going to lash out and respond in a bad way. This destroys psychological safety and warns the next person to not even bother. And we're going to talk a bit about the individual and the importance of self-awareness in leadership. But what I really want to get to with this conversation of why does it feel so impossible to fix bad leadership? I want to talk about the business law of the linchpin because I think that plays a big role in how and why and what. I want to look at why, like the impact of hiring the wrong leader, the major root causes of bad leadership, and ultimately what can we do to address it.
Yeah, no, I think that it's really important for us to be talking, to us to be at least be referencing kind of like, the fact in most private sector business, unless the CEO or the owner is governed by a board of directors or a group of shareholders or whatever like that, there is no person above them to kind of like identify the problem.
Mhm.
So there it does kind of rely on that leader to have a bit of that self-awareness, like you said, and have a bit of that desire to to improve themselves. And again, and that's kind of what is, like business coaching is really heavily a great solution for and those types of things. But I do think that again, it's going to be a good topic for us to talk about outside of that scenario, in the other scenarios where there is a board, there is a group of shareholders, there's somebody that is responsible for resolving a problem with leadership. How is it that we can?
Or there is self-awareness and critical reflection, right?
Yeah,
Like, because
yeah,
sometimes, I mean, sometimes people get to a point where the problems have compounded to a point where it's like, okay, even if I don't know that I'm necessarily the problem, I know that a problem exists and I need to
right.
seek help for it.
Yeah.
That's at least a better starting point than what we often see of there's a problem, but it's not me, it's you.
Yeah, I mean, and the other scenario that is we do see sometimes in private sector businesses that have have like an owner CEO is that sometimes that they have surrounded themselves with confidants that will actually like they actually can talk to, like maybe it's people that work beneath them or maybe it's mentors that work beside them or other people that can actually help shine a light on that. So, but yeah, I do think that kind of that preface, I think that it is going to be really good for us to talk about the impact of like hiring a bad leader, that sense of like what happens if the leader is the one that carries all the responsibility, and everything's really dependent on that one person. What do you do when the person and everything falls onto is the problem. And I think that's
Yeah.
really kind of at the heart of this conversation, which is why you're right. I think we should have a little bit of a reintroduction or at least a summary of the business law of the linchpin. So we did an episode on the business law of the linchpin, I think last season, and where we kind of broke down what it looks like in different categories. But here I want us to really focus on what happens when the leader is that linchpin.
Yeah, so just a quick summary. Really, what we're talking about is a linchpin is kind of that critical role. It's a depend. We've created some sort of dependency on a person, and in previous conversations, we've talked about how it can often happen with like high performers in sales or in other roles that create this dependency on one person, and when that person disappears, the whole house of cards comes crashing down. In a leadership perspective, oftentimes the CEO, the owner, the highest executive in the organization is a linchpin by default and by design,
Hmm.
um, because that position carries a tremendous amount of responsibility. It carries a tremendous amount of authority within the organization, and when that linchpin is removed, when it's not effective, when it's broken, that causes significant impact throughout the entire organization.
Yeah, and we talked about, and it's funny because like I mean, we've said this a number of times in the podcast about just how critical leaders are to organizational stability and sustainability and growth and how like just how vital both your again how vital your middle managers are but your executive your top executives
Yeah.
are just make or break for any kind of whether it's government, whether it's nonprofits, whether it's private sector, regardless, it is just so fundamental because leaders they shape the entire system that the organization works in. They are the captain steering the ship.
And that's a hallmark of a good leader, right? Like if we, I know that we're focused on kind of bad leadership with this conversation, but it's important to also highlight the inverse, right? Good leaders are going to shape systems. They're going to create systems that run independently from them. They're going to create levels of autonomy and responsibility within their management teams and within different levels and layers of organization. The challenge is that we unfortunately see this far less in smaller or medium-sized businesses than we do in larger corporations or companies that have let the money to recruit a really effective, really strong leader, right?
Mm,
Or that it's not owner leader led.
right. Yeah, but I mean, actually, I'm going to push back a little bit on it and say it's not just good leaders that shape systems. Bad leaders or even mediocre leaders still shape systems, right? I mean, it's a matter of how
Fair. Yeah.
dependent they are on them, right? Regardless, it's like well, we often say this with
You
culture.
either shape it with intent or you shape it by default.
Well, that's just it. Like the way we talk about culture, culture is defined in your organization. It is reinforced, it is established, but it's often done as by default or by accident or by cobbled together from decisions that maybe had no strategic plan around them. But it happens. It's made regardless of your intent. And a good leader knows that and plans to shape the culture and shape the systems with some kind of, again, strategic intent. Mediocre leaders maybe have some plan. Bad leaders are almost kind of divorced from the idea of the natural consequences of their decisions and their
Yeah.
actions. Right?
And yeah, I mean, let's be clear, bad leaders are not bad people.
No.
There are a lot we've seen, unfortunately, just the nature of our work puts us in contact with a lot of problems because we don't get hired when the ship's sailing smoothly, right? Um,
Yeah, well, just like we talked about in the
it's
last episode, that we either go in for growth, which is often because a good
Yep.
leader has brought us in and wants us to help them get more of what they're doing, or there's a merger and we're trying to like help shuffle the cards.
Yeah.
But
Well,
But
there's usually some sort of crisis or some sort
yes,
of
a big part of our
trigger
work.
event that has
Yes.
caused significant disruption.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah,
Disruption is probably the majority of our work. And it's something that, yeah, usually things have gone wrong. Like we stepped in kind of like after a problem has happened and not before. So we're usually trying to, kind of help after.
course correct.
Yeah, course correct. It is a big part of what we do. It's not all that we do, but it's definitely a big part of what we do. But I mean, we've seen and we've had like organizations come to like talk to us that they feel like they're in like an existential problem
Yep.
when they have this leader that they are so dependent on that is shouldering so much weight, and they as a board or as an executive team or as or whatever it is, council knows that this person is not a bad person, but they are the wrong person for this specific situation.
Yeah.
And but they just don't know how to like untether all of these things that this one person is holding together. It just seems so overwhelming to them.
And oftentimes from like this, we see that type of scenario happen after growth,
Yeah.
right? Which kind of ties in a bit with the another concept that we've talked about on the podcast, the technical founder paradox. And this can happen from an owner founder context. It can also happen from a hired CEO executive context where the skills that made them successful in the role, that made them successful in growing the company and growing the organization, now that the organization is in a different phase of its life and development, those skills are actually holding them back.
Hmm.
And that is very common in after significant periods of growth. And it places this weird dynamic where you have somebody who has been so effective and so critical to the success of the organization, that has performed well for potentially years and
Hmm.
helped really shape and turn the organization into what it is today. And yet suddenly they're missing things. They're dropping the ball. They're creating more problems than they're solving. They don't seem to have a good grasp or reality on the situation. And it's not the person, it's not even that they are necessarily, I wouldn't classify them as a bad leader. They're ill-equipped. They have the wrong, there's a mismatch in the skills and that they require. And it's our responsibility as organizations, as leaders, as executives, as boards, councils, whatever accountability structure you have, to make sure that we put the right supports and systems in place to support that individual and get them the skills, or get somebody in there who has the skills to support them.
Well, I mean, I think it's one thing that we should just make sure that everyone is perfectly aware of is that, especially when you're going through growth, it is completely understandable for there to be a organic change to where the leader it becomes a bad fit. They organically become a bad
Mhm.
fit.
Yeah.
And that is just like that's because they've stayed the same, but the organization has changed. Right? So I mean that's just a natural consequence of when that scenario happens, right?
But it's why leadership development, professional development at the leadership level is so important, right?
Yeah.
It's why leadership coaches can be a
Mhm.
critical resource to you. It's
Yeah.
why you always need to be searching for I mean, it comes down to often you don't know what you don't know, but it's your responsibility to find out.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I just want to have us get a little bit into kind of like some of the impacts that we see of the wrong leader, and then and then get into a more of a discussion into the causes of it. But
Right.
um,
We need to actually get through the pieces we were going to talk about, not just ramble as I
yeah.
tend to do.
So I mean, the thing is that again, like I said, it does feel again like we do see these organizations coming to us when we're onboarding a new client or we're having some of our discovery conversations that these problems do feel like, so they do feel existential. Like they rarely they feel trapped once the organization has become dependent on this person, and they just don't know what to do because often what they're seeing and why they recognize that this is a bad fit, that this is a bad leader for this situation, is things like informal power becomes almost like the go-to piece rather than creating formal accountability, rather than it being checks and balances and kind of like transparency in how stuff is done. It's about power consolidation, and it's about the not allowing people to kind of like be able to kind of question decisions,
Yeah.
and because it's almost like decisions get made in a black box, and there's no accountability for the need for there to be other perspectives or things like that as well, right?
Well, it goes back to the statement earlier of, leaders shape systems, right? Regardless of good or bad. A good leader is going to shape systems in a way that creates more accountability, more autonomy, that empowers people. A bad leader or the wrong leader is going to create systems that create more dependency on themselves, that
Yeah.
consolidates that power through
Mhm.
not structured, formalized, articulated systems, but more of a, well, this is just the way that I'm going to hold on to this. I'm going to keep this
Yeah.
authority myself.
Right. And that creates these decision bottlenecks, and that
Yeah.
creates all these slowing down pieces because it's funny, one of the most common things that we see when there is a bad leader or the wrong leader in the scenario in the situation is they have protected their longevity by creating by almost like insulating themselves with the dependency. So by bottlenecking decisions and by making everything run through them and by this power consolidation is like it almost becomes almost like a defense mechanism of like I know I'm out of my depth. I kind of know I'm a bad fit. So what can I do to protect myself from this job? I'll make everything more dependent on me,
Yeah.
which again makes that so the resolution of whoever it is that's trying to resolve this situation and trying to like be able to kind of allow the organization to act becomes even harder because they feel more and more trapped because it's almost like the leaders getting more and more like embedded in and rooted
Hmm.
into like getting under the skin of the organization so that they're harder to get out.
And I think if you're looking for what are some telltale signs or what are some at the very least yellow flags, if not red flags, decision bottlenecks is a big one,
Yeah.
right? If there's that consolidation of, everything needs to go through the CEO or the owner, there isn't a decentralized authority, decision-making structure. Everything gets slowed down as it moves up the chain. Those are telltale signs that you have some structural problems and that you have potentially a bad leader in place,
Well,
or at least an ineffective one.
communication bottlenecks are the same thing. Like we talked about.
Communication bottlenecks, decision-making bottlenecks.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Like we talked about communication bottlenecks in an episode we did, I think, in season two. We talked about about toxic leaders, about how if all the information like to a board or to a council or to the shareholders only goes through the one person, then they shape the narrative,
Yeah.
right?
But
So
it also reinforces that it's impossible to get rid of them because they're so crucial, right? They've turned themselves into a linchpin that
yeah,
through fear that if we pull this pin, the whole thing's coming down, right?
yeah.
Which is why it feels like such a crisis to have a bad leader, or if you are trying to figure out how do I address this problem. Um, because if I fire them, what's going to happen? Is the entire organization going to go under?
Yeah.
Do I have because it's not like you can let somebody go one day and necessarily have somebody lined up ready to take over the following day, right? There's going to be recruitment, there's going to be onboarding, there's going to be a lot of steps and potentially a not insignificant period of time where you will be quote unquote leaderless or
Well, let's be perfectly clear. Sometimes we step into that gap when the leader has been removed, and we step in as a transitional temporary
Yeah.
solution.
There are solutions to that.
No, I was gonna say, but
But
like,
that's the fear that drives the lack that holds people back from making that decision.
oh yeah, but what I'm saying is, but like, even though there is someone lined up to step in on the next day, but it usually takes us like sometimes it's 8 months to a year to try to to try to like sort out all of these broken pieces, trying to decentralize, trying to just break the bottlenecks, trying to move from the dependency,
Right.
like because again, it's
If
not.
we're brought in to like rebuild, fix the damage that's been done, yeah, it
Yeah.
can be a lengthy process. If we're brought in to steer the ship while they find their next person, it can be significantly less. But I mean, these problems haven't been created overnight. You can't
No.
expect that you're going to get out of them overnight either, right?
And
There's a process, there's a structure, there's reinforced behaviors, there's
mhm.
fear,
Yeah.
there's a lack of psychological
There's
safety.
trauma.
There's a lot of institutional trauma that comes with it. Like
Yeah.
the impact, the longer you leave a bad leader in their position,
Mhm.
there's a multiplier on how long it's going to take to
Yeah.
fix that problem
No,
or
that and
fix the problems they've created.
yeah, and that's just it. Like, there's so much, yeah, that has to be like we've often compared it to like like letting like mold grow in your house. Fixing it early on become it's a much smaller rent.
While it's surface mold, it's easy to deal with.
Yeah, yeah, but like we
When
have
it gets into the
yeah
and behind your gyprock, you're
yeah we've gone into places and we've had to tear everything back to the down to the studs
yeah,
metaphorically to help because this is one of the things that we often tell organizations when we step in is we say, let's be clear, you can't bring somebody in with how broken everything is. Like, it's going to take a while to fix all this stuff.
yeah,
Just like, you can't sell the house while it's torn down to the studs. You're going to need to like do the renos first, then you can start, like courting buyers, right? It's the same
yeah.
kind of idea.
Well, it's because you don't want to fall back into that same technical founder paradox where you hire somebody. If you were to just tear things down to the studs and hire somebody to replace it, that's a certain skill set.
Yeah.
And that skill set is different from the skill set that you're going to need for once the organization's been rebuilt.
Hmm.
How do they take the company to the next level, right?
Right. Yeah.
So there's understanding what you need, and I mean, yeah, you have to understand what the context is in which you are bringing somebody in. So if you want somebody to come in and fix, then it's probably going to be a short term, well, I say short term, but shorter term
Mhm.
project. If you want somebody to come in and grow, you don't want to bring them into a situation that they have to renovate the entire
Right.
company before they can do any growth.
Yeah, and again, like, because otherwise you're trying to recruit a unicorn, and then and yeah, and those and that's just always a setup for failure.
Yeah.
All right, so
Yeah, your business strategy cannot be based on finding a unicorn.
no, no. All right, so let's talk about kind of the root causes. Why is it that organizations fall into this role? Why is it that again, like, it's painfully more common to people than they realize having the wrong fit or a bad leader into the role. And I think one of the biggest causes is the urgent hires.
Yeah.
Because I mean, like, whether it's through again, like a retirement that kind of happened a little bit sooner than expected, or someone moved on to another job and and they just put somebody into the role temporarily, and then they just made them the CEO or whatever it is. Those are often, again, like, hiring urgently and not having strategic intent with, do we have the right person, or like you said, were we in a situation where we needed where the organization was going through a transition for a year, so we hired the perfect person for that transition, but now they're still here 3 years later, and we've hit the ceiling on their skill set,
Yeah.
right?
And that's really common. That's
Yeah.
really common where you like organizations you lose a critical leadership position and it's a scramble of we need somebody in this position. We need somebody who can stabilize, somebody who can work, with the staff, rebuild relationships, address the structural issues. So we're going to find that we found a great person. We're going to hire them, and they do a phenomenal job because you've hired for the right skill set.
Hmm.
But you've hired somebody who can do what was necessary a year ago or 2 years ago to get you back to a place where you can grow.
Right.
They probably don't have that next set of skills that you need to take the company to the next level. And then you're into this situation of, well, we've just hired this person. Do we fire them?
Well, the other thing that I've seen a lot too is they like I've talked to a number of boards that have that have, like nonprofit boards that have lost their ED or their CEO, and they go, okay, well, we just need to hire the person who the one that we lost wasn't the upgrade of that person. But they ignore the fact that they're in this messy transition period
Hmm.
where the new person can't come in and hit the ground running because the organization is not ready for them to do that. And you hired for this growth skill set, but you're in this messy transition period, and the person doesn't have the skills to handle the mess, and you've set them up to fail because I can't think of any nonprofit that you and I, or actually, or any municipal organization, or I can't think of any business that we've talked to about that's been in this period that somebody at the table we were talking to wasn't pushing. Let's just hire someone now. Let's just recruit them right now, and
Yeah.
they hate it when we say slow down. You need to make sure that you can hire the person that you need when you
Hmm.
need them. And most organizations don't love that advice. They because they want this to be over, so they force speed over rigor. And that is
Yeah.
a fundamental mistake when you're in these messy situations.
And this is where acting roles can become problematic.
Yeah.
I've seen it many times. I see it. I think I've seen it. I've probably seen it more so uh, in NGOs than I have in private sector, but I've seen it in private sector as well, where somebody will be appointed
Hmm.
as we lost this critical manager leader role. We're going to just appoint somebody from the team to serve in that position until we figure out what's going on. And then, okay, we're 6 months down the road, and the house hasn't burned down around us. So let's take away the acting title and just make them the full-time leader in the role. That I have not seen that work out well often. I've
Hmm.
seen that, I've seen the reverse far more common, where I can think of a couple of pointed examples that I'm trying to not make it obvious. But when somebody is brought into that role, it's usually with it's usually a stretch for them already in an acting position of this is a new set of responsibilities. It's a new way of doing things. It's a new set of skills that you're going to have to develop. And you can keep things together fairly well, for a short period of time. Over time, the gap between the skills required for long-term sustainability and growth are very different than the skills required to just keep the ship running in the same direction in the short term.
Well, I mean, you and I have said that there's a big difference. People really need to understand almost like what is the definition of an acting role and what's the definition of an interim role? Because an acting role is you are so if you become the acting CEO, you still have your main job's worth of duties, and you're taking on usually 60%
Yeah.
of the acting role. So you're just doing the stuff to keep the lights on. You're keeping the place from burning down is the ceiling that you're looking for, right? So them just kind of treading water is success in an acting role, which is why it's so dangerous to think, well, if they were successful in the acting role, they'll be successful in this role because they were only able to tread water.
Yeah.
That's
And the
all you
problem
ask.
that I've seen is that it's not even necessarily that the person wasn't a couldn't have been a good fit. It's that we stopped supporting them.
Yeah.
We didn't invest in their skills. We didn't invest in making sure that they would be set up for long-term success, not just the immediate stability success.
Right. Yeah. We said tread water for a while, and then we'll check back on you in 6 months. Oh, you treaded water. You're doing this job well.
Yeah. You haven't drowned yet, so
Yeah.
keep going indefinitely.
Right, but the reality should be, okay, we need you to tread water for the first 3 months. Then if you do well, we'll start investing in your
Yeah.
development to see if you could actually swim full strength, like
Yeah.
become the person that we want
We'll
you to
get
be.
you a life preserver, then we'll get you a boat, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
it's
yeah, exactly. And whereas, so again, an acting role is usually they step in and they're doing 60% of the job for a short amount of time. An interim role is they step in and they're doing 100% of the job, but they're doing it under a much tighter timeline or sorry, a defined timeline.
defined
They
timeline.
usually have a specific mandate. It's like, get us to this point, then the job ends.
Yeah.
And that's usually what an interim role is. Usually interim roles are um, a year, maybe two at the most, but they're about going through a transition and having 100% of the job for a transition. And then that job ends and then someone new
Yeah.
or if that person could be hired if they've shown the growth, but like it's a defined scope and they nail that defined scope, but that defined scope does not mean that they have the ability to work to do the job indefinitely because they just had to hit that scope.
Well, it's like we've been saying all along. Like it's getting the organization to a point where they can hire the skill sets that they need for the future, not just the skill sets that they need for the immediate.
Right. Absolutely. So we see a major cause of the wrong leader in the wrong position because of the urgent hires, right?
Yeah.
So and again, often the urgent hires are a immediate appointing of an acting or an interim, and then just taking away that interim or acting because they didn't drown. Um, so that's one of the major causes. But actually, I want to touch on that too. Another cause that we sometimes see is that they didn't get they didn't recruit for the right skill set that they were looking for. They recruited for sometimes the safest skill set, or
Mm,
the people that were hiring were acting on limited information and didn't have the full scope of what they actually needed. They just hired the wrong skills because they were misunderstood the actual skills that they needed for the roles. They hired the safest person, or they hired the one that with a antiquated skill set or whatever, right?
yeah. And this is unfortunately common if there's a disconnect between those who are hiring and the operational reality.
Yeah.
It's why we strongly like we really push investigations
Hmm.
because you need the context to understand what you need in the short term, what you need in the medium term, and then it's the strategic vision, the goals, the strat planning that's going to determine what we need in the long term. But those things are often not the same, especially when you're going through crisis or going through growth or going through, a loss in leadership positions. It's really, I know we keep harping on the same thing, but it's really important to understand the context in which you are operating today and the context in which you want to operate tomorrow.
Yeah.
Because if you hire somebody who can only focus on today, you're shooting yourself in the foot for tomorrow.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So, um, I think that one of the things that just to kind of almost like take that point but adjust it a little bit is the idea of one of the other kind of root causes tends to be when we almost like conflate competence with leadership. Like when
Mm.
somebody is really good at their current role,
Yeah.
and we say, okay, because they're really good at this current role, then we end up over promoting them into a role that
The
they're not
Peter
equipped for.
principle.
Exactly. Yes. So that's another side of it too. They think, well, this person's been around for a long time. They know everybody. They're really good at their current role. So then, then they would be a good fit to become the new CEO. And again, that's just as broken as not understanding the operational realities that
Yeah.
you need the person to work in, right? It's just again, it's trying to simplify trying to find easy answers to a really complex problem. It tends to be where a lot of recruitment errors come from.
Yeah, I think another big root cause of all of this is fear.
Yep.
It's the especially if you have somebody in the role who's not necessarily terrible, but you
Hmm.
know that they're the wrong fit, or you can see that maybe they're not dropping the ball at every turn, and maybe you don't have a mass exodus of staff because of their terrible leadership or management practices, but there's a fear of disruption.
Yeah.
There's a fear that, well, if we remove this person, how long is it going to take for us to find the right person? What is going to happen in the meantime? How are staff going to react?
Hmm.
It's I think fear holds back a lot of decision making because, well, it's the devil you know versus the devil you don't, right?
Yeah. You're right.
And we know that this person, it also complicates things when when they're a nice person,
Yeah.
when they're somebody who's pleasant,
Hmm.
who maybe they get along really well with the teams. Maybe they've done a good job in building some camaraderie and building an environment where people feel safe to speak up and engaged in their work, but they don't have those skills that you need to take the company to the next level, right?
Well, I
There's a
mean,
lot of fear that will hold back decision making in terms of what's going to happen if we go down this road.
because I mean, like, just to touch on what you just said, because sometimes it's a matter of the leader, the CEO, the executive, has good leadership skills. Like they are a consensus builder. They do care about building people up and everything like that too. They've got those personal qualities that make them people want to follow them. But they're a bad manager. They don't hit timelines. They don't know how to build systems. They don't know how to delegate. All these things that are essential to the actual growth and operations get completely missed. But because they've got the great leadership qualities, it masks it, or it makes the option of living with the damage a bit
Mm.
more seem less risky than than correcting the bad hire, right? I mean, like, so it's one of those things where it's almost like it erodes it slowly, and then you don't realize how far you've come because the person seems to be, again, very surface level, have the right things in place, but then when you actually dig down, it's not built on anything, which is why we always say, yeah, kind of going back to leaders shape systems. And if that
Hmm.
system is dependent on them, then it may seem like, from a surface level, that if they do have psychological safety, and if they are very, like staff focused, and they are pleasant to talk to, and but everything's dependent on them, you as a board of directors, you as a shareholder may not know that this is not a good scenario, that this is
Yeah.
bad because there's no system for them to operate on. Everything they become this linchpin that is damaging the organization, but you don't realize it because you miss some of these yellow and red flags. And then the fear of, okay, well, it can't be that bad to fix it. Let's just, let's just kind of live with this rather than actually kind of correcting it. Is like you say, it's just that we don't want to disrupt things that are working, so we'll just let it go. And that's just hits that multiplier effect where the problem just compound to compound to compounds. And by the time something does break, the fix is massive.
Yeah. And sometimes it's reframing the solution or the goal of what we're trying to do. Sometimes it's not only how do we get rid of this person?
Yeah.
Um, because in some cases it's that may not actually be, the best solution.
No.
Sometimes maybe the reframing or the goal needs to be more around how do we stabilize the system so that no single person can destabilize it, right?
Right.
How do we put the structures in place? How do we create more autonomy, how do we divest decision making throughout the organization? How do we de-risk
Hmm.
bad leadership
Yeah.
or ineffective leadership or a mismatch in skill set in leadership,
Hmm.
right? This needs to be viewed from a risk management perspective. I think that's one takeaway that I would encourage people to look at reframing this conversation through is risk
Yeah.
management. What is the risk to the organization? How do we create systems and structures and supports that are not dependent on any one person?
Yeah. Because one of the things that we really want to also make clear, we talked about this in a recent episode. We talked about is comfort kind of good or bad at work, but we talked about the sunk cost fallacy.
Yeah.
The idea that, well, if we already have this leader in place, you've already invested in time in them, then we'll just kind of keep putting good money after bad. That is completely completely going against the value of risk management, like you said, because we really want to make sure that we are fully aware of the consequences that that letting this stuff go, putting good money after bad, what this really does hurt us. So it's really important for us to not fall into this sunk cost fallacy of just, like we've already put the time into it, we already kind of have it in place. Let's just kind of let it go. We need to, like you say, have that risk management approach because risk management should be something that we are always looking at. Not when things go wrong, we should be looking at a risk management.
No, you want to do your risk management while things are operating well, right?
Exactly.
So that when you hit the rough patch, you have a strategy, you have a plan in place, and you can respond rather than react.
Yeah. So how can you do that? And I think that's probably, the most important question that I hope you listening are actually we're actually waiting for us to get to because like you
You
said,
only had to wait 40 minutes for.
yeah, but like you said, we don't say just get rid of the person. We say, if at all possible, if the person has, if there is the ability for the person to come back from the situation, if then training and those kind of pieces like that too can be helpful. But
A really effective leadership coach, professional development with some clear expectations of what you want to see changed
yeah.
can be a first step.
Yeah, but actually, even before that, that's usually a great action. But usually, the first step is to have an external
Yes.
diagnostic
Yeah.
of your organization to assess the risk, to assess the situations, to again to bring someone in that will be able to kind of unearth some of the pieces that maybe are everyone is kind of blind to because it's just part of their everyday,
You
and
need the
have
data for
right.
your decision making.
Yes, have an objective view about realizing, identifying the risks, realizing, being able to kind of like see the system that does exist, see the
Yeah.
good and the bad, and then give you options based on that. And that's the kind of thing and that's why when we go into organizations, regardless of kind of what their situation is, if it's growth, if it's merger, or if it's crisis, we always do the diagnostic first because we want to have that objective third party view to kind of unearth stuff and ask
Yeah.
the right questions so we can see what is the best path forward.
Well, and part of it is we specialize in particular areas. And I'm at the risk of sounding arrogant. Um,
You're starting now with that, with that?
okay, we're a little beyond the risk.
Right. Sounding arrogant.
Sounding arrogant, the data that we collect is usually better than the data that we're given
Hmm.
because especially for the owner, CEO, founder level, it's really hard to have an objective view of something that you're very close to.
Yeah.
And usually they know what they want to do. And they usually have a pretty good sense of what the problem is. But where that problem stems from
Yeah.
is sometimes difficult to assess on your own. And that's something that we do. And so the initial diagnostic or investigation gives us clarity to make sure that any recommendations that happen going forward are tailored to the outcomes that you want based on the reality of the situation you're in.
Right. Because most of the time, the executive, the board, the leadership team, the staff are very aware of the symptoms,
Yes.
but they often don't have the perspective or even know the right questions to ask to get to the heart of the sickness.
Well, and they often all each have a piece of the puzzle,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And so it's collecting all the puzzle pieces and putting it together in a way that makes sense, that tells a narrative of here's what's happening and here's why it's happening.
Exactly. So often, yes. So the first thing that again, these organizational assessments are great identifying risks, and it's great to do these assessments while everything is working well.
Yep.
It's we don't get to do it very often, but we love when we get to go into an organization where things are working well, and we can say, here are the things that are going to be
Yeah.
coming up that you might want to be aware of.
We've got a
Um,
couple of those and they are
they're a
fun.
pleasure.
They
Yes, they
are a
are.
pleasure.
Yes, as opposed to our usual, which is okay. So everything's on
The
fire.
house is burning down. Please
Yeah.
help.
Yes, exactly. So that's the first one thing we say because often with those strategies that come from the assessments, 'cause assessments are usually just the means to get the strategy, and then the
Yeah.
strategy is usually their recommendation, let's say, on leadership coaching, on kind of mentorship programs that can work, on professional development, on new structures and organizations and stuff like that too. Often, though, when you get that strategy, it's like, okay, well, we have this, but now what?
Yeah.
This is when the other pieces of advice are usually very helpful, which are leveraging external supports through either fractional executives, bringing in somebody with experience and perspective that can
Mhm.
actually have the skill set to help implement the things that are needed to improve the systems without, again, without running the risk of falling into
You're
the,
not hiring them full time.
yeah,
It's usually on a number of hours a week or a month.
yeah.
It's a way of accessing high level talent um, with low risk. And I mean, there's obviously a cost associated with it because you're paying for expertise. But
Mhm.
fractional executives, fractional support can be a really important way to increase organizational capacity and skill.
Yeah. And then and then once you know what has to be achieved and you have your plan for how long it's going to take you, looking at transitional leadership or interim leadership of someone else coming in to create space to fix the systems without kind of triggering organizational panic. Right, you're bringing in
Mhm.
somebody on like who's going to be creating a new position possibly, or you're replacing somebody with a fractional or sorry an interim or a transitional leader whose job it is to move you from where you are to where you need to be that's stable so that way they're either not needed anymore or you can bring on someone permanent. This messy transition period is something that you're going to be going through, so you almost need to just have the right tools to get through it and not expect everyone to help you navigate this messy transition off the side of their desk or assuming that they have the skill sets because often they don't. These are very specialized skills sometimes. So you want to make
Yeah.
sure you've got the right people in the right place to get you where you want to get to, which will save you time, money, talent, all the kind of stuff that you want, but you have to invest in it, right?
I think what I want to leave people with, or the kind of the last thing that I want to say, is around the most dangerous leadership hire isn't always the one that's the loudest or the most obviously the worst. It's the one that your organization becomes too dependent on to question.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. You're right. It's the one that where it's too ingrained and too
Yeah.
and you're right. Dependent is really key to it, which is what the whole idea of the law of Lynchpin is about. But the law of Lynchpin, it's not about blaming someone. It's not about saying this person's a problem or it's about recognizing that there's a risk. There is a problem. There's a system structure that has to create dependency.
Yeah. We have put our organization at risk because we are so dependent on somebody. This can even be somebody who is incredibly effective. But
Mhm.
if your organization's success lives and dies with one person, that is a massive risk that you need to mitigate and address.
Right. But the idea of recognizing these risks is to do the best scenario is to do it early enough that you still have choices, that you still have options, that you are not trying to only see the fact that there was a fire risk while the building is burning down, right?
Yeah.
So it's really important to understand that the law of the linchpin is just to say that this is something that's built into structures. This happens. This is an organic thing. It's a common stumbling block, especially when it comes to growth. So
Yeah.
this is something that is going to be in your organization. So if you need to find a way to de-risk it, and there are solutions that you can to do it, but it's best to do those things before the fire starts. All right. So I think that about does it for us. For a full archive of the podcast and access to the video version hosted on our YouTube channel, visit roman3.ca/podcast. Thanks for joining us.
For more information on topics like these, don't forget to visit us at roman3.ca. Side effects of this podcast may include improved retention, high productivity, increased market share, employees breaking out in spontaneous dance, dry mouth, aversion to the sound of James's voice, desire to find a better podcast.